Hi, and welcome to this Ignite Webcast. My name is Josh Topal, and I'm a Program Manager for Office 365. Ignite events are a series of technical workshops for IT professionals and Microsoft partners, and the Ignite Webcast will address different technical subjects and scenarios that are really beneficial to anyone that wants to increase their knowledge of the Office 365 suite. So today we're really excited to have Ali Powell as our presenter. Ali has been a delivery resource in Microsoft Consulting Services in the Americas for enterprise services for 7 years. And he has served as an application development consultant and architect for a lot of customers, including Boeing, Toyota, Hawaiian Airlines, and even Disney. So in today's webcast, Ali will discuss the Office and SharePoint App Model. And so this is a really great opportunity to hear directly from a Microsoft employee with such experience and to learn some of the new features and releases for Office 365. So today's webcast will be about an hour. And if you're new to this, we're going to leave a few minutes at the end to field questions from anyone on the call. So the best way to do that is to type your question into the link chat box. But we do ask that you hold these questions until the Q&A portion, which will be about the last 10 minutes. So one last thing, we are recording today's session, and we will have the PowerPoint presentation on the blog post, which I'm pasting right now into the link chat window. You can also download an earlier version of the PowerPoint within the link window itself. So that's it for me. So Ali, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Thanks, Josh. Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to this webcast. As Josh alluded to, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Office and SharePoint App Model. Very concretely, what we're going to do is we're going to try to talk specifically about some of the changes in how you would develop applications in Office and in SharePoint prior to the latest releases. And then we're going to dig a little bit deeper in terms of some of the technical aspects or considerations you need to be aware of when you're building these types of applications. Then towards the middle of the deck, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the opportunity model from the perspective of how end users will gain access to the functionality available. And then we'll close out the discussions around just some more details around what other types of applications exist on this model and how this model can be used to support you in some of your future endeavors from a development perspective. So when we look at some of the changes that have been released in the latest versions of the Office products, primarily in the area of Office and SharePoint, 6 key investment areas surfaced. First and foremost, it's the notion of apps and the cloud app model. And when we talk about apps, really they're talked about along 2 key themes. The first theme is, you're probably aware and have heard of, apps for Office. And Apps for Office represents a model to deliver functionality that live and exist and flow with the various types of documents that exist within the Office space. The Cloud App model exists as a paradigm change for how you develop and provision applications that will run and participate as part of the SharePoint ecosystem. So we'll drill more into what these app models mean and how they're represented. But in terms of key investments for this generation of releases, those notions of application models and the investments that they've been made were key. Secondly, we have to think about the notion of having these applications. You need a marketplace, or you need to have some means of acquiring these applications. And to do that, there's 2 public marketplaces that exist for each type of apps. For apps for Office, there's an Office Store. And for apps for SharePoint, there's a SharePoint Store. And we'll look at these different marketplaces in terms of how you can develop applications, how end users can acquire those applications, not just from a consumer perspective, but also keeping control in place and governance in place from an IT acquisition perspective as well. To build these types of applications, you'll have to have some type of client model or app model that you can leverage and program against. So the key APIs were changed in these releases to support parity against having the capability to support applications to be developed either from a client perspective, and that's essentially developing applications that run within the browser. Some of the modern apps that we develop and interact with today are built along this model. Secondly, is from a SharePoint perspective, what opportunities exist for you to build server-side SharePoint applications. And we're going to drill a little bit deeper into the definition of what server-side SharePoint application actually means as we get through some of the slides. But we'll talk about how parity has been reached between having an object model that is common from developing applications on the client or on the server. Secondly, the fifth big investment was workflow. And the biggest fundamental change, just to drill into that, is workflow has moved to become an app or behave exactly like an app based on the cloud app model for SharePoint. And some significant investments were made in workflow to give it the capability to scale in such a way that doesn't require it to be heavily dependent on some of the inner components from a SharePoint perspective. So when we talk about the runtime for workflows require a host. And what the investments have been made is that workflow hosting model has now been moved out of the app model from a SharePoint perspective, and it can be provisioned and deployed independently on a standalone instance. And workflows are then deployed to that instance, and they interact with SharePoint via the standard type of APIs that are made available from a RESTful perspective that the applications that you would build would be dependent on as well. And lastly, the key investment was in the area of access. Access has moved to become an application that runs on top of SharePoint, but some of the capabilities and the nuances that you experienced potentially in the past with leveraging access from the perspective of how access gets deployed, how its components and functionality are consumed by end users, and the backing store that supports access has been modified. And again, we'll drill into a little bit more detail in terms of what some of those investments were and what those changes are in the new platform that we'll talk about. So let's look a little bit at varying apps and the models that are supported for apps for Office and also apps for SharePoint. Next, again, as I talked about, we'll talk about the acquisition model of how end users or IT gains access to these applications. And then what I'd like to do is spend some time drilling into what it takes to actually get started to taking advantage of some of these new capabilities. So let's talk about the app model. When we look at this app model, we have to take a step back and look at the landscape upon which how applications are being developed today. And typically, I like to tell people, when you're looking at developing applications for Office, Office represents some of the most diverse real estate for an application to be hosted on, just in general. End users have the ability to interact with Office via the standard environments that they're accustomed to authoring Word documents, the browser from an acquisition perspective, Excel, which is very popular. These applications end users natively are accustomed to interacting with authoring and consuming content within these tools. Also, from a SharePoint perspective, there exists a substantial amount of resources that exist today. Over 700,000 SharePoint developers exist within the marketplace. So if you take the real estate opportunity from the perspective of having the opportunity to build capabilities onto a platform that has diversity within the marketplace, and then you take those capabilities from a developer perspective in terms of the means to be able to build solutions to leverage on top of that real estate or that platform. The synergies between those two are fantastic based on today's market. When you step aside and you look at how applications are being developed today, there's been heavy emphasis in building solutions that what we call web applications. And those web applications typically are built in a technology of the end user's choosing or the developer's choosing. But the interaction points in terms of how users consume that technology is typically through the lens of HTML5 and CSS3. Those are becoming a substantial kind of the lingua franca that's used to define and consume application functionality within the market. And more importantly, we're seeing developers gain skills very quickly and maturity within this space to be able to build HTML5 applications to deliver solutions within the enterprise and externally within the public marketplace. And we recognize, and you guys are probably all familiar with this, any application that's built today typically doesn't just service the end users from the perspective of functionality. They also provide a capability that gives people, other developers, to gain access to their APIs and that functionality so they could be consumed from a composition perspective to build other solutions. So we find ourselves as developers not just building the platform to support the UI, but we also find ourselves building the platform for the headless opportunities where other developers can take advantage of our capabilities and leverage them within their apps. Some of the core principles around taking the marketplace, looking at the trends in terms of the skill sets, and applying that to what are some of really the patterns that we're seeing within the marketplace to take advantage of this. First and foremost is the notion of designing for the cloud. If we kind of peel that back from a perspective and we say, really there needs to be an ability to have symmetry between the applications you develop today and where they're hosted and run tomorrow. So we wanted to make sure in the platform that we built from an Apps for Office and SharePoint Office perspective supported the notion that regardless of where the application was run, it could be hosted in a variety of different models. And that's represented by on-prem, that's represented by off-prem as well. To do that, we needed to make sure that the IDEs or the frameworks that are consumed by developers provide the capability that developers can build solutions and focus on the solution or the application at play, as opposed to having a dependency on the platform. And a real example of that concretely is we've all built applications where at compile time we found ourselves very intimately aware of the interfaces or very intimately aware of the assemblies. And that created somewhat of a tight coupling between the application that we built and the runtime host that it can be supported and executed within. So we wanted to make sure that moving forward, as far as the platforms that we support developers, we create a somewhat isolated environment that freed them from having to be intimately aware of the underlying components that are hosting the application. So from a model perspective, you can think about it as being able to sandbox applications, not in the classical sense that you think about sandboxing, but from a hosting perspective, such that hosting environment can insulate us from wherever the workload might run to support it. And then lastly, the notion was choice. As we look across being able to support building solutions, one of the key things that's coming to surface is there's a substantial amount of open source frameworks. There's a substantial amount of tooling and hosting providers that exist there. We wanted to make sure in the platform for where future applications are developed, can be developed, we gave engineers or software developers the ability to have choice in terms of where they actually wanted this workload and what hosting environment they wanted to support to deliver their solutions to the end users. So when we look at that, we say the notion of a new app model needed to be created, and it's been coined the cloud app model. And think about this cloud app model is the notion for you to build new applications that can essentially be consumed by end users from a variety of different devices. Secondly, we needed to make sure that when we provided this app model, it was built based on standard tooling that is very familiar and mature within the marketplace. So embracing web standards was key. Providing choice was a very important opportunity because there has been tremendous momentum from the perspective of the amount of open source APIs that exist from a JavaScript perspective. Those frameworks and the capabilities available within those frameworks help developers very quickly take advantage of functionality that in the past would have natively had to been just developed on their own. And then secondly, flexibility of the lifecycle. What this means is we wanted to provide a means that if we were to build applications and have those applications be consumed by end users, we wanted to give IT, the IT administrator as well as the developer, flexibility in terms of how those applications can be acquired. That acquisition model talks about deployment. From a deployment perspective, we could have a public marketplace. This is known as the Office Store. And this is really the notion that you'll have the capability to acquire applications from an IT or an end user perspective from a trusted location. Secondly, you needed to have the capability to give IT the control to deliver solutions within the enterprise that you can deem as trusted solutions that really support the business need. So we'll talk about the flexibility of how those apps are acquired. But one of the key benefits of that notion is you get the capability to manage the life cycle of how those applications are matured from a sustained engineering perspective over the lifetime of it being deployed within the enterprise. So let's talk a little bit about what apps can do. And to do that, we have to take a step back and say, the types of applications that used to be developed in SharePoint in the past, what capabilities were they provided to the enterprises that we leverage? And we looked across that about 2 different types of solutions that could have been created. When you think about applications developed for SharePoint 2007, it really allowed developers to write code and utilize SharePoint, the SharePoint API server side. And these custom code solutions could be deployed to the hosting web application, and we know that they were placed within the bin directory or within the global assembly path for the GAC. Code can be secure from a code access perspective, but it typically runs in full trust mode. These types of solutions are added to the farm within SharePoint by an IT pro with console access, and typically someone that has farm administrator rights to deploy those solutions. When we look across it and say, that's one type of classic solution that could be developed, another type was a sandbox solution. And sandbox solutions were introduced in 2010, and these solutions can be uploaded and deployed to the site collection by site collection administrators. And they provided some flexibility that came with some trade-offs in terms of only a subset of the functionality was made available in a sandbox solution. Additionally, the server-side code could not make any calls, to externally hosted web services. So when you look at the types of solutions you had native solutions that were called full trust solutions that ran on the server and had some exposure that it placed to the SharePoint instance. You also had sandbox solutions. When we move forward to this new app model, the limitations that existed between those 2 types of, the caveat, that came with those 2 types of deployment models have really been removed from a certain extent to give you greater flexibility in terms of the richness of the APIs as well as the types of functionality that you can leverage. So apps in the new app model can do 2 things. One, they can run on any platform of your choice. What that means is I can build an application that very quickly is hosted on, for example, a IIS web server or even a PHP web server that provides functionality that can then be used to access data or capabilities available within SharePoint and hosted directly within my web app. So now I'm not necessarily tied to thinking about how my application or solution is hosted from a SharePoint perspective. I have the capability now to pick the platform of my choice to develop my solution on and then gain access to the SharePoint functionality by leveraging some of the new API capabilities available from a server-side perspective, which means there's compile time in the web app that I developed, or from a client-side perspective, which means my application leverages JavaScript APIs to interact with SharePoint. So that provides some really liberating opportunities for developers to build solutions on the platform of their choice and bring in the SharePoint experience from the perspective of accessing specific SharePoint capability and surfacing within their apps. This provides a great amount of flexibility in terms of how you can think about building SharePoint solutions in the future. When we step aside and look at apps for Office, we talk about that in the context of apps for Office. In the past, you would create leveraging Visto tools, and you would compile directly against the Visto binaries or interfaces to be able to leverage the type of application that you wanted to build. Now, in the new world, applications themselves are hosted by a runtime, and this runtime exposes a JavaScript object model. And this JavaScript object model provides the capability for your app to interact with the hosting document, to provide capabilities to the end user so he or she can leverage Word, for example, and take advantage of all the capabilities in Word, but also have your application interact with it. And to do that, I wanted to quickly jump over and just show a quick demo of how that could be accomplished. Are created from two templates that exist within Visual Studio. The first one are apps for Office, and these really target the Office product suite from the perspective of being able to build a Word application or being able to build an Excel application, etc. And then there's apps for SharePoint. I'm going to pick an app for Office example for now, and let's say we wanted to target Word. I selected that I wanted to build an app for Office, and in doing so, it's basically asking us really the first of three key questions. The first one is the shape. When you start to build applications in this new app model, you're going to be asked, what shape do you want your application to take within the hosting application? So there's three shapes that are supported, and then those shapes are backed by a hosting app that have the capability to surface it so the end users can consume it. The first one is a task pane app. And a task pane app is very similar to the task pane we're used to when we're using the thesaurus or we're using the dictionary within Word. And it really has the capability to be docked on the left-hand or the right-hand side of the screen. And I can pick the type of runtime host that my application can target. Next, a shape is what's called a content app. And content apps right now live only within Excel. And a content app within Excel behaves exactly like the same functionality you get when you create a chart within Excel. And you have that chart interact with data that's on the spreadsheet. And lastly, you have an app that's known as a mail app. And mail apps are very interesting from the perspective that mail apps have the capability to interact with the context-sensitive view that an end user might be looking at when they're dealing with Outlook. As we look at Outlook, we're normally addressing or interacting with Outlook in some context-sensitive manner. We're either looking at our calendar, we're looking at an email or trying to respond or create an email, or we're looking at our task list. Mail apps give you the capability, based on that context, to have activation rules that let your app light up based on the context the user is using Outlook in. For the purposes of this demo, we're going to create a Word app, and we're going to have that be a task pane application. What you'll notice about this model, which is key from a development perspective, is I have the ability to build one application and target multiple runtime hosts. For those who have built Office applications before in the past, you recognize that to leverage this, you would normally have to create some abstraction of your own to be able to somewhat bifurcate your applications from being tied to some of the interfaces that might be only natively made available in Word. Now you get that capability directly with an app for Office where you can target multiple runtime hosts for the ability to build your app. So for this one, we're going to pick Word and Excel, just for purposes. What's interesting about apps that are built in this new cloud model, the first thing to pay attention to as we look at this is the notion of what's called the manifest file. And all these applications that are apps in the modern world, you have to look at kind of really what's the anatomy of an application. And an anatomy of an application is basically described in that's represented or can be interpreted by the host of the runtime environment. And that's represented by the notion of an app manifest. Apps for Office have an app manifest, as well as apps for SharePoint have a manifest. The manifest really holds two key pieces of information. The first key piece that we're going to drill into is the launching URL. This launching URL within an app manifest basically says, once the runtime host has activated the application, where should the application get its functionality from? From what web application or from what URL can that application light up and give the experience to the end user? So they point directly to a URL location that could exist on some HTTP endpoint or HTTPS endpoint that exposes the web application so the end user can interact with it. Secondly, from an apps or Office perspective, you have the notion of capability. And you think about a capability, if we take a step back and look at how applications are developed today, modern applications that are created today represent the notion of a runtime host. And this runtime host requires applications to make assertions about the types of requirements or capabilities they require access to, so the functionality that's expected by the app can be delivered to the end user. The same is true from the declarations of capabilities that exist for apps for Office. So here we're saying one of the capabilities our application require is workbook capabilities. And the workbook capabilities, these have some alignment to the types of app for Office that exist, but they point to the notion that our application itself can interact with workbooks or spreadsheets from that perspective. Secondly, it can interact with a document. And that document exists to say a Word document that exists, we want to be able to interact with it and gain access to the functionality so we can essentially light up an experience that can enhance what's made available to Word and to the content that's being authored by the end user. The third and final item is when an application runs, that application must make some assertions about the type of permissions or entitlements that it would like to have. So in this instance, it's being asked that our application is going to require read-write capabilities to interact with the document. Once that's defined from a manifest perspective, the manifest itself is typically what's deployed to the runtime host to get an understanding of how the application should behave. Fundamentally, this is a big difference in terms of the applications we've all created in the past, where it's a compilation, and not only does the configuration go, but the customizations from an implementation or a coding perspective go to that end user for consumption. When we look at apps in this new cloud model, the only thing that's delivered to the runtime host is a manifest. And this is true from the perspective of SharePoint as well as the perspective from apps for Office. So the only breadcrumb that's made available, so to speak, within the environment of where the app was required is the representation of this manifest. I'm going to go ahead and click Start, and we'll just see a quick application that gets run. Before we do that, though, I do want to show you our app and our manifest file basically an HTML page. And on this HTML page, when I open it up, it has some standard HTML we're accustomed to seeing. An important piece of functionality that's described within this HTML that becomes And this is true for typical apps that are hosted based on a hosted model, is the notion of the application model. And this application model, from an apps for Office perspective, is made available from the JavaScript object model that's brought in from this reference right here within HTML. This basically brings in the Office runtime app model such that when your application is running, it can interact with the hosting Office application. Outside of that, everything else that you see is standard HTML and JavaScript. I do want to open up the app just to show you the functionality behind the scenes that drives the web application. Is a standard app initialize, and this app initialize has the capability to reach into the hosting document and interact with it. So we can see here, when the application gets lit up by the app for Office and it's hosted, we append some information to the HTML page that will allow our application to interact with the Word document when it's running. Let's go ahead and start this so you can see it. Okay. So as you can see here, I started. This application has been run, and my spreadsheet here is running over on the right. I can interact and create numbers. I can do everything I'm typically accustomed to doing within Excel or within Word, and interacting with that within the document. What you notice here over on the right is the task pane application started. And this is the standard template that you get for your app to run here. But this application is running over on the right, and we should spend a little bit of time, because this is a technical discussion, talking about the mechanics of how that's hosted. This window is being hosted and run within IE by the Triton engine. And it's hosting and rendering that HTML page based on interacting with the web application that was deployed as part of my Visual Studio solution. So this is a standard HTML page that I can right-click on and view source. And when I do that, you'll see the source actually looks exactly like HTML. And it's the HTML that was represented within my Visual Studio project that I was working on. The thing about that is now my app can interact with the content in the page such that when I click on this button that says Get Data from Selection, you can see here now my web application running on the client was able to interact with the text that was available within that spreadsheet. And we can click to see others as well. So what we've just shown and just briefly demonstrated is the application itself is hosted on a web application server. The app manifest was made available such that it was able to light up within Excel to load which web app, the starting entry point for accessing that web app. And once it got activated, it could interact with this document from my web app in the standard way that we're accustomed to interacting with content made available from applications that are hosted within Office documents. Go ahead and close that. The same is true when we build solutions. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new SharePoint project. And this time I'm going to pick a SharePoint app. And I'm going to say app for... One of the things you recognize on this next screen, I want to pause for a second, is typically when you were doing SharePoint development, you had some requirements from an app dev perspective on the environment within where you're going to perform that development. First and foremost, you typically had to have the SharePoint SDK and access to those assemblies. You also needed a host when you were going to deploy your SharePoint solution to do debugging and validation. With apps for SharePoint, now you get the capability to define an app, and you can assert where you actually want your application to be deployed from a debugging perspective. The nice thing about this is you can leverage the Office 365 developer site as your host for your SharePoint apps during development. So this makes building applications for SharePoint, eliminating a substantial amount of the friction because you don't have to stand up that SharePoint environment anymore. You can target a dev environment in Office 365 and do your development there. The next key point from a SharePoint perspective, when we talked about host, in apps for Office, we talked about the host having the capabilities or being Word, being Excel, being Project. You also have the ability to specify the host for your app you're going to develop from a SharePoint perspective. And 3 options exist. And when we talk about these 3 options, we want to make sure that, at least from this group, you understand kind of what some of the decision points are around those 3 options. The first one is AutoHosted. And the AutoHosted one is the default one, and specifically what that means is a Windows Azure or SQL Azure instance will be provisioned behind the scenes as your web application server as well as your backing database instance if one is needed, such that when your application is deployed, it will spin up a new Windows Azure instance, deploy your web applications to that instance, as well as any bits related to SQL Server. And then your URL, when we talked about the launching point, the URL will point to that instance that was provisioned by Windows Azure for you to get access to. So auto-hosted really give you the capability to not necessarily be concerned about the runtime environment, taking advantage of the capabilities available on Windows Azure and Windows Azure websites to be able to host your web application so it can be lit up within SharePoint. The next option is ProviderHosted. And ProviderHosted is really the notion of bring your own infrastructure. So as you think about this, these applications essentially provide the capability for you to say, I'm going to stand up my own instance of a PHP server. And this PHP server is really going to be the web application that hosts my functionality I want to expose within SharePoint. So you really get to bring your own infrastructure and make a decision at deployment of what type of infrastructure you want to support the workload your application is providing. Lastly, you have the notion of a SharePoint hosted. And a SharePoint hosted we should spend a little bit of time talking about is provider hosted and auto hosted gave you the capability to build the solution and control completely the stack or the APIs that are going to be consumed from a compilation perspective. When you go with SharePoint, the SharePoint hosted app has some differences between the prior two. First and foremost, SharePoint hosted apps only give you the capability to deploy an application that is provided from an HTML or JavaScript perspective. Just the long story short, that doesn't give you the capability to provide server-side code that you can compile and deliver with your SharePoint hosted app. So SharePoint hosted app really do not allow any server-side code and use all of the client-side capabilities made available in the object model available from a CSOM perspective. So in this instance, I'm going to pick a auto-hosted, and I'm going to click Finish. What you'll see from the Tooling Studio perspective is very similar. We're looking at the Start HTML page, or in this instance, because it's going to be running on Windows Azure, it's in ASP.NET is the runtime that's going to host my web app. So it's giving me a default .aspx page. But as I mentioned, it's really important to go to the app to understand, include it within an app manifest from a SharePoint app perspective. So even though from a schema perspective we see some differences, there's still some key things to point out here. First and foremost, from a SharePoint app perspective, we still have the responsibility of when this app is lit up and the end user accesses from a SharePoint perspective, what web application do I point them to so we can light that experience up within SharePoint? And you see here, that's showing a URL that's pointing to a ~remote app URL, which is at compile time when this app is deployed. That'll be replaced with pointing to the tenant of Windows Azure that was deployed that points to my web application. So you see here, the start page of a launching URL becomes really key for SharePoint applications as well. Secondly, we look at the app principle. When you build applications from SharePoint, they require this notion of some context related to authorization. And that's represented by the app principle. This basically says that my application will be deployed to a Windows Azure instance, and that Windows Azure instance will have the capability to auth back into SharePoint provided it needed to gain access to any functionality. And that's done via a nice standard technology that's well understood and accepted within the marketplace, and that's accomplished via OAuth. So your application is granted access to run within SharePoint, and secondly, once that app, which is hosted by the infrastructure of your choice, is provided the ability to reach back into SharePoint to gain access to any features or functions that are germane needed by your app. But that's accomplished from an authorization perspective, and the authorization scheme that's used or supported is OAuth. And then lastly, this app prerequisites basically says what are some of the dependencies this app has. In this instance, the type is auto provisioning, which just basically means when it's deployed, we will require that a Windows Azure and SQL Azure instance are spun up so we have a web application target that our SharePoint app could be hosted by. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the HTML or the default ASP that we looked at before. And we see here there's really nothing in this page. I'm going to type in I'm going to go ahead and click Start to build it. Like what we talked about, now this application, what's happening behind the scenes? First and foremost, the application itself is being provisioned out to my SharePoint tenant. Additionally, a Windows Azure website instance is provisioned out for me on my behalf so I can get access to it. Once that deployment process is done, I'm presented with a standard logging into my Office 365 tenant. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to log in. Excuse me. I have lots of instances. So I'm logged in now, and as you can see, the application was requested to be installed within my tenant. Again, providing full control from an IT perspective. Once I select Trusted, what's happening now is SharePoint has created an app web, and within that app web, it created my manifest and pointed my application to the Windows Azure instance that got set up. In this instance, I am debugging and managing everything on my local machine. So as you can see here, the URL that's selected is my standard Cassini or my IS Express instance. So I accessed the app from SharePoint. SharePoint looked at the app manifest associated with my app, found the app URL or the start page URL, and redirected the user to that URL such that you can see within my application, it's just made available for me to get access. And it says, welcome to SharePoint 2013. Important thing to look up within this URL, some information that we could look out is you can see the host URL provides you access and information as a token that's placed in the query string to give you access to what actual instance or what site was the application attempting to be the launching point upon which your SharePoint application is provisioned. So you have access to a variety of different tokens which all can be managed from the app manifest file when your application is launched. Go back to the deck. The demos were fairly lightweight, but what's important in the amount of time that we have is what can apps do? And I like to just answer this question and leave it for the audience is applications can pretty much do and provide functionality that is really made available for any type of web application that can be built today. So apps can support the enterprises on the platforms using the language and the toolings and the frameworks that are readily available to address the enterprise need. More importantly, apps for Office can interact with apps for SharePoint to create really good symmetry between extending the application to live with the Office documents, but managing exposure to that application from a SharePoint perspective across some of the collaborative capabilities that are made available. For example, you could leverage an application that's associated with an app for Office related to a Word document. Have that Word document, when it's saved, be submitted directly into SharePoint to start a workflow. And that workflow could be driven around whatever business process that best supports the enterprise or supports the marketplace from the application that you're building. So really the possibilities are endless in terms of your ability to build solutions to support Office. So let's jump to looking at how applications are acquired. And applications are acquired now typically, let's take a step back and look at apps we've developed for Office. If you developed an app for Office, it was deployed to the local machine. All of the components and pieces, the constituent pieces of that app, were native on the environment where they're actually going to be run and hosted. And the same were true for SharePoint. If we look at now the new model where only the manifest is deployed, and that manifest points to an application that provides greater IT control, having the capability to deploy and sustain and engineering these applications removes you from being tied to the version of Office or being tied to a specific version of SharePoint. So the capability for end users to acquire these applications, since the life cycle of sustaining them has become pretty much independent of how you want to manage your app from a sustained engineering perspective. We talk about how do end users gain access to these apps. And there's two places that are supported. One is the Office Store, and that's the public marketplace that we're all accustomed to acquiring content like we do on our phones these days. The Office Store represents a public marketplace that's trusted, that applications that are deployed there run through a sense of analysis in terms of how that app is going to behave and meeting what we call the minimum bar from an Office storefront perspective in terms of the types of apps that can be hosted there. So acquisition can happen at the Office Store. In addition to acquisition can be happened internally from something called an app catalog. And an app catalog, you can think about it as a private storefront created by the enterprise that's only available to end users within that enterprise for them to gain access to those applications. And that's called an app catalog. As I talked about, these two models and the notion of a manifest-based application, or that being the breadcrumb that's left within the environment, it makes it fairly frictionless for you to update your applications because your applications now, the updates are focused on the hosting environment you selected and managing the steady state there. When we move on and we look at applications for the store, we have to talk about how those applications are acquired. This fundamentally is a big shift in terms of how you provisioned or delivered applications in the past. The opportunity is fairly large when we look at the marketplace upon which end users consume Office documents or organizations leverage SharePoint. The applications you deploy no longer require the enterprise to stand up a separate install or put those bits natively on those servers or on the end user's desktops. We deliver a manifest file that's interpreted by the runtime that's supported for the host. So that creates a nice opportunity in terms of how IT administrators or end users make decisions about the opportunity to acquire your application. Secondly, it builds on the notion of simplicity because the solutions that get acquired can be acquired from one consistent location, and that's either the Office Store or it's from the app catalog that's available within the enterprise. To do that, though, it was really important that developers had the ability to still have governance and control over the applications that have been deployed and how they're being consumed. So licensing capabilities exist within the APIs from an App for Office, a SharePoint for Office perspective, that can be taken advantage of from the Office Store, such that you still have fine-grained control over the exposure of your applications that have been deployed. Secondly, again, as we talked about, the hosting scenarios for your runtime, you have full control over the selection of that. So the opportunity, we touched on this a bit. We talked about what the actual landscape looks like from a consumption perspective and from a capability perspective in terms of the skill set. The audience is the marketplace itself is available in 231 markets. So it's pretty much multilingual in terms of the broad reach your application can have. And visibility, now you'll have the capability through telemetry to gain access to those APIs to know how your application is deployed within the wild, and you'll be able to glean that data and make better decisions about how you expose your app and how you provision your app to end users. The trust, again, applications that are hosted in this marketplace go through a rigorous standard for validation that end users are accustomed to gain access to those apps. And lastly, you really can start to insert yourself into a marketplace now where there were huge barriers in the past in terms of the applications you had to build, to have broader access to the types of applications you can build based on this new model. So from a simplicity perspective, the simplicity is really threefold. First, full control over where it's hosted. That host could be Office 365. That host could be on-premise. The web application, you can select the platform host of your choice. Full, complete freedom in terms of the best platform to suit your needs in terms of the type of application you want to deliver. Secondly, the acquisition point. It's no longer bits that need to be delivered from the standard packaging perspective if you're thinking from an MSI perspective. Now you have the capability to support acquisition from well-known locations. That's either the Office Store or that's the app catalog that's made available within the enterprise. And then lastly, and this one is really key, this one is about the ability for you to have simplicity in terms of sustained engineering your applications. And when we're thinking about sustained engineering, we're thinking about two things. Telemetry, really, how has my application been consumed? What type of users are consuming that app? And then secondly, how do I need to be able to support VNets of my application? And what does that look like from a lifecycling perspective? And you can leverage the existing knowledge and maturity that typically exists within organizations now by application developers of managing web applications through their lifecycle as they rev them. I like to just really talk about power, and we touched on some of this before, but really the real power that you can see hosting your app from an Office and within the Office Store is you have licensing APIs, you have an acquisition point to be able to monetize access to your app. You really have a full environment from a commerce perspective to give your application the capability to be acquired, and you can monetize that leveraging that marketplace. Secondly, for Apps for Office lives with the Office document. So think about the viral capability of building those apps. They travel with the document throughout the enterprise. There's still IT control over which apps can be lit up within a document within the enterprise. So IT doesn't lose the fine-grained control over access to apps, but your apps themselves live with the document and become viral across the experiences all users will have consistently with it. And secondly, from an upgrade perspective, again, you have APIs that give you the ability to interact with users to drive the life cycle across new version applications and getting them access. I want to build out the slide because it speaks to visually what we've already talked about in general. And that is developers from a build-out perspective can host their applications directly in the Office marketplace for acquisition, or they have the capability to package up their applications. It's what's called an app. This is different from the packaging we're accustomed to from classic solutions. And then that app could be sold directly to the organization. And then it could be hosted within Office or in SharePoint from an activation perspective that end users would like to consume. Additionally, that process of acquiring an app from the Office storefront or the SharePoint Store could still lead to opportunities for developers to build solutions where they go directed interaction with the ISV or the app provider to gain access to that solution on a broader scale within their organization. So as we look at this, let's finish up on. And to start building apps for Office or apps for SharePoint, you have a variety of options. And those options really span the spectrum of the type of end user that's building that solution. Across the left, for power users, and typically it's interesting we use the term power users, but a power user really is looking for a very friction-free opportunity to build a solution that meets a very transacted business need. And they're not interested in leveraging some of the heavy tooling. So they can leverage Access 2013 with Access services hosted by Office 365 to build solutions that are applications that target a very transacted scenario. Next, as you move towards the middle of the spectrum, there is an opportunity to build solutions on what's called codename Napa. And if you think about Napa, it's really akin to building solutions within the browser. So let's take Visual Studio from a perspective, some aspects of Visual Studio from an ID and an authoring perspective, and make that available by developers to consume in browser. So the nice part about that is I'm not required to have all of the build out of the layout of the Visual Studio tooling to build these solutions. And that's available for apps for SharePoint as well as for apps for Office. And the Napa development tools exist as part of a site. It's an application that you add to your SharePoint instance that gives you this capability to build these solutions right within the browser. And then towards the right, we look at the spectrum from a IT pro or a pro developer perspective. He or she is going to have the Visual Studio tooling made available, and I showed a demo of that very quickly for them to be able to build solutions as well. So on that note, when we talk about creating your first application, one of the things I like to leave behind for folks to seriously consider is go to dev.office.com, spin up your free instance of an Office O365 tenant. In that O365 tenant, you have the capability to build out or add the Napa tools. So I have up, I just wanted to show this really quickly. My browser, and I'm pointed to my instance where I've installed Napa, and you can see here, SharePoint redirected me to Napa.cloud app. And as I click on project, I'm presented with the same type of wizard to walk me through the type of application that I want to develop. And I can still develop an app for Excel, and I can create, let me do that, Ignite. Click create. And I have access to that experience directly in the browser. This is very convenient for being able to really build solutions very quickly such that you can test them, and that dev test cycle is just substantially reduced because you're not tied up with having the tooling readily available within the environment. And over here, I get standard controls that we're accustomed to from a Visual Studio perspective. I'm just going to go ahead and click Run on Jack. And And what's happening is it's going to package that solution, and then it's going to deploy that solution as a SharePoint hosted solution and then launch it for me to get access to it. So when we looked at those three kind of architectures for the Cloud App Model, I'm going to click here to open it in a window. See, I'm going to be challenged off within my app. AudioDev. I'm going to click sign in. And now it's loading Excel, and because I picked Excel to be a content app, it's now loading my Excel application right here within the app. So I can click on Write, and now you can see in my Excel web app, my app for Office was able to write directly to it within the browser. So this is not me using any tooling from a Visual Studio perspective. I can build out these experiences natively from a browser to build solutions for the enterprise. On that note, to wrap things up, you can get started. Certainly go to office.com/preview. Dev.office.com is where you can go to get access to your developer Office 365 tenant. And that blog post there is a great post for looking at sample applications that will drill into more detail in terms of how you can build these apps and take advantage of them on your side. On that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. We'll leave. I know I ran a little bit over in terms of time, but I want to leave this open for folks who can stay for any questions people might have. So, Josh, I'll turn things back over to you.
Thanks. Great job, Ali. Great presentation. And we do have a couple questions, so I just want to make sure we get to all of them. But real quick, you can find all of our Ignite webcasts at this link. You can find upcoming ones, and you can find a link to this one, which will have all of our materials, including the PowerPoint and the video. But we do have a couple of questions. So, Ali, are you able to see the link IM window? So
I can. Yep. Let me see. Let me scroll back up. Let's see.
Yeah, and also to make it easier, if anyone has a question that hasn't been answered, if you can go ahead and copy and paste those into the window, then we can just kind of start fresh. But we do have a couple, actually, that are just right above mine.
Yep, so I'm just going to take the first one. Hi, Terry. The question was, do you require an Azure account for AutoHosted? The answer to that is no. An Azure account is not required for auto-hosting. Auto-hosting is essentially, if you look at Azure websites, it's leveraged by the Azure websites where an instance is spun up and your web application is deployed for you on your behalf. So an Azure account is not required to take advantage of the auto-hosting capabilities for an app for SharePoint. All right, let's see, I'm going to scroll up. Can you create a Word add-in that will populate a SharePoint list? So just clarifying some language there, Robert, good question. So when you say add-in, I'm going to change that to say if you're meaning, could you create a app for Office that targets Word and then have that app for Office populate information within SharePoint? The answer to that question is absolutely. Your app for Office can host and gain access to either, depending on how it's built, the server-side object model, and within that object model accessing what's called now the _ API, your applications can interact with a SharePoint site and create instances of lists, could create instances of documents, can do a variety of different things available to that API. So the answer is yes, and we've seen some scenarios that I've built before that basically have if you think about it, a loan application on the left, and we drive workflow from a web application over on the right. And we're able to have the loan administrator interact with the loan document while updating information and workflow within SharePoint. So absolutely, that's possible. The question is there a step-by-step guide or blog post that shows how to add Napa? There is. Larry, I'm going to ask you, my email address is alip@microsoft.com. If you send me an email, and everyone is welcome to do so, I'll be more than happy to share links to that so you can see how you can provision your dev instance as well as add the Napa tools to it. Let's see, let's come back. So this is a new app model. Some customers, devs, are hesitant with 1.0, anything. How often does Microsoft expect to rev this app model to mature it? Bruce, good question. So certainly us deploying this capability available within SharePoint is new in this release. But if you take a step back, web applications and how they're being built within the marketplace are very mature. And you can look at the types of solutions that are being developed within the marketplace that have substantial adoption and uptake in terms of what capabilities are available. From a SharePoint and App for Office perspective, as you rev it, really the notion of rev is what capabilities are going to be made available to the runtime host. And the runtime hosts typically are interacted from a JavaScript perspective based on a JavaScript client-side object model. So as you look at changes that are going to be made available, likely the changes that will be made available won't be substantially fundamental. Those changes would be more likely providing richness of the API so your applications can interact not only with just apps for Office, but also SharePoint capabilities natively within them. So over time, will the model itself change? It's highly unlikely the model itself will change. And what I mean by that model is you look at the cloud model. The cloud model is really, if it's running on SharePoint, there's no server-side code. It's only client-side and HTML. If it's running off SharePoint, you have full control over that infrastructure and that selection. So that's an IT or a design time or architectural decision that you make. Will we please share the slides? Yes, we will. That'll be made available. I know Josh did. Let me scroll up to get some higher questions. Does the licensing scheme differ for each app model? So no, the licensing scheme doesn't differ from each app model. The licensing scheme it depends if you're asking from a SharePoint acquisition perspective or you're asking from the applications that you're developing. So I'm going to answer it from an app for Office or an app for SharePoint perspective. Regardless of how that app is acquired and installed in an instance, the licensing scheme is at the discretion of the application or the ISV to build. In terms of, from a SharePoint perspective, are there varying licensing schemes that let you take advantage or Office applications? This functionality to acquire apps is natively available in all licensing types. Can the app be hosted on a Linux machine on-premise? Terry, great question. That answer is yes. You can pick whatever infrastructure you choose to host your web application and have end users consume it. So like I mentioned, it could be Azure, it could be technically an Azure VM instance that's hosting Linux, or it could be something that's running on-prem because, again, it's just a URL that end users point to gain access to your app to light up. So absolutely, you can pick any technology that you choose. How is MS committing to future compatibility of the APIs, i.e. when Office 2013 comes along, the APIs we wrote all stop working or need massive retesting/refactoring? David, that's a good question. The answer to that is that the fundamental shift as we're looking at apps for Office is, from an app for Office perspective, you are coding against a JavaScript API model, and that API model exposes functionality available to the developer for he or she to consume. And typically, that's what your application is going to code against, whether it's an app for Office or it's an app for SharePoint. SharePoint's a tad bit different from the notion that you can build your own web app and you can use the server-side API model. But Microsoft will be following the standard process from the perspective of how we look at APIs from a deprecation perspective to support it going forward. I would tell you this, leveraging against the object model is going to be the best way to insulate your application from any radical changes just in general. From a JavaScript perspective, that model is somewhat, the app model is well defined. Certainly that could be revved in future releases, but you're definitely insulated from the notion of being tied to assemblies or interfaces from that perspective. You'll be coding against the JavaScript app model. Let's see. Going through some more of the questions. Is there a step? I answered that one. Let's scroll up. I answered that one. Licensing scheme we covered. Will the video be published on the mentioned link? I think Josh covered that. Let's see. Yep. I think I might be through most of the questions. Let me scroll down to the bottom. Oh, here's one. Do we have any public best practice guidance which covers SharePoint platform capabilities? We do. If you send me a link, again, alip@microsoft.com, I can send out that information so you can have access to it. Apologies if it's stated already, but are the slides available? Yes, they are, Sean. We reviewed VS and Napa fairly quickly. That looks like all the questions, unless you see one that I've missed, Josh. I think I've gone through.
Yeah, I think that's it. And again, if you have an additional question, Ali's email is up on this new whiteboard, and you can also contact me on the community. I posted that link. But yeah, great job. We're a couple minutes over. But thank you so much for joining today's